to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Lacy Brooks Pack, Neon Moon, Part 3, by Michael Lockhart. The BBC was intrigued. She was a lone hunter, but so much had befallen her since the wicked Two-Legs had taken her to the place of pain and hiding. She longed for the tall trees and isolation afforded by the deep, piney woods. She knew that she was not too far away. She needed only find her way eastward and a little north. She maintained her padding stride in that general direction when she could. Her anger from the foul injection began to fade. She no longer batted at the nasty Two-Legs, who seemed bent on destroying their own habitat. She was happy enough that they would soon have no place to live, even on the zombie serum. She had managed to find the humans unsavory as a meal. She had dined on a yapping little dog that had been yapping at the heels of one of the Two-Legs. The thing never noticed its small companion had disappeared. After her close call with a group of armed Two-Legs, she found herself following a pack of cryptids that were accompanied by a pair of Two-Legs. One of them had an interesting odor, something wild about him. One of the female dogmen smelled of something else. The keeper. It was faint, but no doubt the blood of that fat beast. She would need to investigate this mystery, at least so long as the pack traveled in the right direction. Earl fell back to parallel Valerie. The young dogman whom Lacy had recognized as young Pete had fallen into his former position. The pack now surged forward on the hunt for and halt troubles. Without doubt, the same place Dr. Z had gone to start them or enhance them. Our pack appears to be growing, he observed to his mate. Pepe Le Pew is on trail, the Squatches are on the flanks, and the Diamond of Dogman is back intact and leading the way to the fray. We poor Two-Legs are here between the gem and the arse end. Dork. The single word reply from Valerie spoke volumes, especially when she favored him with one of her stunning smiles. I just hope we can catch him. No telling what voodoo crap he's done to himself. He's definitely grown and gotten younger, like someone else we know, only he's much more animalistic. Monstrous, maybe. Not sure of the nomenclature, but he is no longer human, if he ever was. He's all the worst of our species, now combined with all the worst of the cryptids. Earl glanced at her. Just a theory, of course. I don't think it was werewolf germs alone that animated that thing. He was hairy and all, but something was different, harder, like a beast we encountered out in the forest. It killed some strange dogmen, and we eventually managed to take it down by striking at its head. We thought that maybe the face eaters. He was interrupted when the pack halted and formed a circle. Adele motioned for them to enter the square of outward-facing dogmen. A deep, screeching yowl rose above all the other noises of the night. The shouting crowds, the sirens, the roar of fires, and the crashing of hard objects against one another, and the screams of anger and fear from the rioting Two-Legs. The new sound was clearly feline in origin, but large. Dr. Z forged ahead, intent on reaching the center of the riotous crowd. He slammed aside any who impeded his progress. Though few of Eve's distracted knuckle-draggers would normally pay attention, something in his size, his demeanor, and his seething rage warned them on an instinctive level to get out of his path. He reveled in the chaos of the night, the breaking and the burning, the occasional beating of property owners, and the mere standers-by. It was what he had hoped to see for years, the beginning of the end for the capitalist pigs of democracy. Deep within his consciousness, he understood that the experimental serum, which he'd injected himself, had altered his mind as well as his body. He felt incredibly strong, fast, and agile, far more than he had ever before experienced, even in his youth. His vitality surged, but his mind wandered back to the incredible, intoxicating meal of long pig he'd enjoyed earlier. To the feast, interrupted too soon by his pursuers, that thought re-engaged part of the old, sinister Dr. Sloyvoik. He decided that he should set a trap for the interlopers. It wouldn't be different. He had only to cause mayhem followed by panic. The disturbances would inspire flight and more destruction as the rioters turned into victims. He wasn't sure if his bite was now toxic, but he wanted to give that a try as well. It could be that he would be able to create many more fiends than those he'd purposely unleashed. He soon found his target. A large mob of rioters had entered into a high-end electronics store and begun to clean off the shelves. He could herd some individuals into a corner and give them a little nibble. His harshened voice made the cackle that would normally issue from his throat sound more like a rumble of warning than a being who attempted to express humor. The sound burst forth once again when he found the test room for video games. There were 4 individuals in the space, and he now blocked the only access point. Jelly couldn't believe his luck. He'd been swept up in the crowd that had burst through the glass doors at the Electrostat Central. Now he found himself in a room with the latest in gaming tech. By the time he could afford anything in that space, he'd be an old man and the tech long out of date. There were some others in the test room. 2 guys pulled and ripped at various modules, destroying rather than taking the devices. He shook his head. He didn't care about anything but the primary console, the best system available for online gaming. He carefully detached the security connections. The system was wireless, so there was nothing else that needed doing. Only a subscription access code, he recalled. He could get that at the employee console just outside the test room. A female who had been engaged in similar act of theft, but with a different system, looked at him and smiled. He smiled in turn. This night just keeps getting better, he reveled internally. Then he noticed her features collapse. The projected emotions morphed from satisfied, companionable avarice to pure terror. Even as she screeched in fear, Jelly found himself lifted into the air and fangs sunk into his shoulder near his neck. He winced and hissed with the sensation, then was stunned when he found himself launched into a set of monitors on the far wall. When he was at last able to blearily open his eyes, he saw the young woman sprawled nearby. Blood leaked from her arm. Then a thunderous roar set his ears to ringing. A flash had nearly blinded him. It was followed rapidly by several more. Then a crimson substance splashed his face, and a coppery stench filled his nostrils. An enormous shadow began roaring and ripping into the 2 thugs who'd known how to do nothing but destroy. One had clearly used a firearm. Now the 2 were scattered about the slaughterhouse that had been the test room. The shadow lurched from the room and back out into the main retail floor space. Jelly could hear the rapid, fading screams of looters who saw whatever the thing was and gave up on their dreams of monetary wealth for mere survival to flee like so many prey animals. The girl looked up at him and smiled through her pain. Guess it's all ours now. We're close, Lacy announced. His scent is strong and he smells angry. The crowd ahead had been swarming into an electronics store, and now figures fled the space, trampling one another to leave it ahead of all others. The rioters in the street that had been cleared at the approach of the altered Dr. Z had been replaced by new insurgents. They now began to alert on and grow alarmed at the approach of Lacy's pack. The space around the shattered storefront was clear of two legs momentarily. Then every member of the pack who was capable let out a growl or rumble of disgust and challenge as an enormous figure limped through the broken glass and falling lights that flickered with power surges and granted a surreal strobing effect. Dr. Z stared at the group of enemies, and his hackles rose at the challenge they'd ensued. He was injured, but not fatally. His wounds had not penetrated deeply into his newly hardened flesh and had already begun to heal. Yet the pain made his burning anger rise to insane fury. The once nimble mind could now picture only rending, tearing, and biting flesh, and gulping blood with zeal. The pause between the various enemies detecting one another was at most a second. No time for a mere human like Val to even register what happened. The bodies of her pack, her family, surged towards the threat, and the threat rushed to meet them. She noted that Earl was among those rushing forward. She wanted to be in on the kill, yet she hung back, since there were too many large predators with chomping maws and deadly claws. She watched as her buddy, Lady Godiva, clotheslined the beast man, even as Sir Slamsalot punched him in the gut. Earl, too, and young Pete each took out a leg, and Adele used her claws to remove the dangling flesh from between the monster's legs. Lacy chomped on his right forearm, and the skunk ape chewed at his face. That left only the left arm for Earl, and he took it. The rest of the pack backed off immediately after their assaults, but Earl was slower than he had been as a werewolf. Faster than other humans, but slower than the cryptids. He twisted the arm until all the joints were locked, then proceeded to break them with unrestrained glee. Yet it was unlikely that the doctor felt the intended agonies. Val watched as Dr. Z, the merciless, lost his struggle. His chest pumped quickly and raggedly with his last breaths, and the torment inflicted by each of the pack members as they took out their individual revenge for the cruelties perpetrated on them and those they loved. Most people would have lost their lunch at the sight, but Val had also suffered at the behest of this demon in semi-human clothing. She strode forward with her little pistol and looked the mad scientist in his remaining eye. Then she fired a round into it. The rapid, shallow breathing and all other signs of life ceased. "It's over," she murmured quietly. The pack enjoyed their triumph for a brief moment. A brace of howls rose into the night from those that were capable, and roars of victorious screeches sounded from the rest. As the echoes and reverberations faded, they were followed immediately by the screams of panicked insurgents who had been destroying the next block. The last two occupants of the warehouse that had been unleashed on the crowd had arrived. Donna, Dee to her acquaintances, had decided that no luxury items were worth the risk of the unfolding destruction that reigned around her. She was already wounded and needed medical attention. She participated in several protests and knew that EMS units would not venture into the area until the violence had run its course. She now fled to her car at her best pace and convinced her new friend Jelly to come with her. It was hard to find, since every vehicle on the street seemed to have been damaged and had activated alarms. The remnants were a few yellow flashing lights and feeble honks. Many had broken windows and flattened tires. She finally spied her little wagon and made towards it. She dragged Jelly along by his arm, Come on, that's mine. If we can just get in it and go. As they drew near, her heart sank. The driver's side tires were flat, and the driver window was shattered into so many splintered, sparkling fragments on the pavement. Shadowy figures milled on the sidewalk. They seemed to shift as they detected her presence. She knew that car alarms were useless. If anyone even noticed one, they immediately assumed it was some idiot who had forgotten where they'd parked and used a fob to find their vehicle. Yet hers had come standard, and she decided to activate the panic button on the key fob. Nothing happened. Evidently the riders had done more damage than was clearly visible. Perhaps the battery had run down with the constant alarm, or someone had purposely turned on the lights so that the battery would drain as a mean-spirited prank. Jelly tugged her sleeve in turn. "We gotta go, Dee. We're not fast right now, and that bunch don't look like they want to be friends." They began to move at their best pace down the center of the empty thoroughfare. A group of rioters had already begun to run towards them. All they could do was flee. They didn't make it far. There were no cryptids in the crowd, only fellow members of their species. The pursuers were clearly prepared to show the pair less mercy than would a monster. Werewolves were typically loners, unlike feral lupins, yet they occasionally found another of their kind and mated. In those instances, they became a pack and would raise a set of twins, much like the dogman species. Carol Wolf and Jeff Wolf had met during their transition to the warehouse. They'd been under the fading influences of the zombie venom and felt a high degree of hostility towards every being and everything around them, except one another. The effects had made them instantly connect and bond as a pair. They were the last to break the bonds during the cryptid insurrection and avoid the carnage wrought by the Genosqua. They immediately sought out a den away from the eyes of two-leg prey folk and other cryptids alike. They'd mated with uncanny frenzy until the venom had run its course, then rested. Now they were famished and worked together to cull some supper from the herd of the two-legs. The group they'd found was not cohesive, simply a gathering of protesters with some empty, amorphous cause, essentially to break or burn everything they could not steal. They'd eventually come together in pairs and trios and work out that they wanted to tear down and burn a particular set of businesses, in particular the offices of several attorneys and bail bond companies. First, they'd have to burglarize the establishment to take the cash on hand. That had gone rapidly, and as the members arrived for part 2 of their impromptu plan, Arson, a stalwart in the herd, who used the handle Duke Kudesh, noted that the pair of predators that loped towards them on the long, heavy-built legs with paws that looked like hands. Duke Kudesh, who thought of himself as a natural leader, chose to shout a warning to his comrades. He was too panicked to think of orders to issue. "What the fu— Ah!" His exclamation transformed into a choked, wet gurgle filled with the pain for a brief moment. One of Duke Kudesh's pals, on the other side of the crowd, joined his fellow pillager on the sudden wet and sticky pavement, and then, as the rest registered that they were under attack by something far more fearsome than the hated police, they began to scatter. Another friend of Duke Kudesh, Anna, found her momentum suddenly increased as she ran. She traveled so rapidly that she left the ground. The sting and pain from the claws that had raked her back as they flung her towards the face of the AAA+ bail bondsman storefront hurt for only a split second. She was smashed against and through the remnants of the glass door, and portions of her body were broken by sections of the brick-lined door frame. The only thing that beat her to her landing was her life force as it fled ahead of her mauled body. The terror went on for almost half a clock minute, an eternity when one is being slaughtered or maimed, before the Lacy Brooks pack arrived. Lacy, Earl too, and Sir Slamsalot made short work of Jeff Wolf, while Adele, young Pete, and Lady Godiva trounced Carol Wolf. By the time the werewolves breathed their last, any of their intended prey that could run had done so, leaving behind friends and fellow demonstrators. The pack formed a defensive perimeter, and each member reported to Lacy what he or she observed. Earl followed up with the last report was done. "We'll have to check the wounded. Anyone bitten but alive will turn. We have to decide what to do with them." Val swallowed the lump that rose in her throat. She knew that Earl meant that they had to determine whether or not to slay the surviving humans. It was the practical, smart thing to do. Casual murder. Granted, these people were thieves and had set out to destroy people's livelihoods. But a death sentence? She had no time to complete the thought. Her sister had made a command decision. Finish any that are still alive. We can't risk a city full of wares. Val opened her mouth to comment, but the pack had already moved to follow their alpha's command. Earl remained behind and took her hand. "I know, but we have no idea how many more cryptids are running loose. For that matter, we have no idea if any cryptids have already been created. They won't have the wherewithal to heal themselves. We're stopping a world-ending plague." His eyes pleaded for understanding. He was no casual murderer. It was not the former beast within that applied this savage logic. It was Earl, the compassionate man, the man who understood that she would object and wanted to comfort her. She nodded and observed that it would not have mattered. The deeds were done, and only one living being was left besides the members of the pack. Lacy held a small dog in her arms, a mix of Chihuahua and Wiener, a Chiweenie. He survived the snapping jaws of Carol Wolf when the werewolf attacked his owner. Carol Wolf had spat him free when Lady Godiva punched her in the diaphragm. Lacy held out the lone survivor to Val. Earl supplied the unnecessary translation of Lacy's high-pitched whines and growls. "She wants you to look out for him. He'll pass out soon from the fever and wake up on his way to becoming a wee dog man." He grinned and helped transfer the barely unconscious new member of the Lacy Brooks pack. Val smiled when the small furry bundle raised its head long enough to give her chin a quick flick-click before he slumped. She had a new friend. As she removed his soon-to-be too-small collar, she noted that his tag proclaimed his name to be Chiefy. The big black cat watched as the other cryptids she had been following gathered, and she was drawn by their howls, hoots, and high-pitched yodels of triumph. It was an odd assortment of creatures, yet they seemed to work well together. When they completed the slaughter of the remaining two legs, they shortly set off with purpose towards the harbor. She determined to follow them and see if they had a better plan for getting home to familiar territory, away from the stench and unfamiliar sounds of the expanded two-legged den that was the city. She thought she had evaded detection, but the old man of the forest saw her. They could see in the dark almost as well as she could. She froze as the big being alerted the others. They fanned out, and she knew she was caught. She stepped forward from the shadows, normally a last-ditch tactic to intimidate opponents, though there were far too many of them to frighten easily. The elder female dogman made some noise and gestures that appeared to be friendly overtures. The BBC simply stared emptily at her for a moment, then growled in a reply. They clearly had no common language. The dog woman rose to her hind legs and approached, cautious but fearless. She raised a finger and indicated the other members of her pack, then pointed to BBC. She circled the finger, then clenched it into a fist. She pointed eastward. BBC fought her nature and finally relaxed her muscles all at once. Her tail stopped twitching and drooped. She slunk to one side but remained clearly visible. The Lacy Brook pack had expanded again. They continued the hunt for any remaining cryptids or freshly bitten two-legs, while on their way to hopefully find the vessel that had borne them to this place of horrors. Most of the two-legs that had seemed so bent on destroying their own dens had fled, moved towards the tall structures, or gone indoors. New two-legs took their place. They dressed alike and carried firearms. Others rolled stretchers, and still others drove up in loud, bright, flashy vehicles and strove to quench the flames that had spread to so many structures. It was past time for Lacy to leave. Any other loose cryptids, established or in transition, would have to be addressed by others. Earl signaled a halt when they approached a large vehicle that had flashing lights, but they were not overly bright. There was no siren emanating from it to punish the sensitive eardrums of wild beings. The pack encircled the large boxy machine, and Earl entered through the open door and searched it. He quickly emerged, a grin plastered on his face. We're in luck. The driver left the keys in the ignition, and it looks like there's still a full tank. He looked at Lacy. If we can get the pack on board and hidden, we can skip the harbor and drive straight out towards home. In the following conference, several of the pack balked at the idea of boarding the city bus. But since most had ridden in vehicles voluntarily by that time, they eventually prevailed upon the rest. The convocation of cryptids clamored or leapt through the doors, and on or under the seats. Sir Slamalots removed a few of the bench seats to make a comfortable space for he and his mate. Earl conferred with Val up front. I can drive it, and it's pretty similar to the big truck we were using. Would you prefer to drive or ride shotgun? Val grinned and kissed him quickly. I've been running to keep up with all of you long-legged beasties going bump in the night. I think I'll rest by riding shotgun. She hefted the small, feverish form in her arms. Besides, Chiefy will need tending. He's about to enter a whole new world. The director stood attentively while he gave his summation to the operators. Crew did a great job, stayed focused, asked no impertinent questions. Looks like our friendlies got away to fight another day. I've dispatched a team to eliminate the last Gugway and bring in Jelly and Donna. They may survive, but they are both going to be pretty traumatized after what the protesters did to them. We were able to stop our rogue researcher who became an actual mad scientist and then a monster. Our team will conduct cleanup on the warehouse. Interesting side effect of his ridiculous great plan. There is now a pack of cryptids running wild, partially. We have them under surveillance. They are formed of natural and transformed creatures, a formerly scratched human and a formerly transformed cryptid who has transmogrified back into human form. The form cryptid is an old associate of mine. We can keep Earl on track and bring him into the fold. He may have a powerful team to employ at need. There was a moment of silence while the operators conferred, and then a chorus of "Proceed." When the cleaner team arrived at the warehouse, the team leader, Lucas, discovered the shivering heap of flesh that was Carlos Forres, the keeper. Carlos was shivering and his eyes contained a feral gleam, yet he appeared to be strong enough and was healing rapidly. The Gugway had returned and taken up residence in the control room. It had finished the leftovers from Dr. Z's supper and now curled in a corner to recover from its wounds. Lucas grinned at Trent, his second in command. Once we get the major issues resolved, I think we should bring in this one and that one they call the Keeper to see which one can win. Gugwe versus one-handed werewolf. Lock them in separate cages for now while we get the place cleaned. Maybe the higher-ups will bring the match to the arena. Epilogue. Congratulations, Mr. Wolf. I think you and your wife will really enjoy this property. We certainly have. Harry Campbell shook hands with the large and significantly more physically fit man who towered over him. Fortunately, the man's feral grin managed to display friendliness. Guarded, but friendly. Ish. Besides, he'd paid nearly double what Harry had for the slice of the property carved from the company-owned forest. It's nice and quiet, though, to be honest, there are some pretty strange sounds that come from those woods. He glanced nervously towards the emerald shadows that loomed all around his property. No, now the property of Earl B. Wolf. He reminded himself as a portion of his mind wandered what the B stood for. Anyway, I hope y'all have a great time out here. Not much to do, that's why we're moving the kids down to White Sand City. It's a little country for the sake of my wife and me, but enough people around here to let the kiddos socialize. Besides, the new job pays better. Thanks again for taking on our livestock. He wasn't sure how to end the conversation. The big man simply loomed and grinned and watched him, with those eyes, like a wolf eyeing a plump cottontail rabbit. He almost shuddered. Earl, I'm sure Mr. Campbell has a lot of things to do. We need to get some things moved as well. The dulcet tones of the knockout woman who accompanied Mr. Wolf purred as she approached and slid a hand up the big man's arm. He gave a sort of shiver and his grin widened and turned, if anything, more feral, but in a different manner. Agreed, he rumbled. You are sure you have everything, Harry? Harry nodded. We did a double and triple check. If you find anything, you have my address. The man with the lupin features and demeanor, who so thoroughly fit his surname, waved, and he and his lady turned towards the nice log home. She's in phenomenal shape, too, Harry thought, but maybe the slightest bump just above the waistline. Lucky dude. Lacy led her pack to the back door of her father's new home. Her sister/stepmother had sold her place near the city. She was now a county prosecutor. She didn't make nearly as much money, but she'd finally decided that country living wasn't so bad, as long as it included the right family, the right pack to live with her. The pack approached tactically as always. Even Grandpa's house could be infiltrated, or he and his mate could be in danger. Besides, it was good practice. Adele remained at the rear, gravid with impending pups. Her mate, young Pete, simply Pete these days, stayed with her too, stalking along in protective demeanor. They had decided to share territory with Lacy and Earl too. When Earl too found a suitable mate, they could consider whether they needed to take on more space. Perhaps they'd go north and take the territory on the other side of the river that had belonged to the now extinct Alpha M pack. The Squatch couple had taken up residence on the far north end of that territory, along a bend in the river as far from the two legs as possible. They and the little skunk ape, whom Val had dubbed Pepe Le Pew, had come together this night to see the home of their senior packmate, to mark the territory and to congratulate the happy couple on their own impending bundles of joy. A slinking shadow loomed at the far edge of the feeble light available. The BBC had made her appearance and now vanished as thoroughly as had the Campbells. A stout figure about the size of a large English mastiff burst forth from the side door of the home. He skidded to a stop and growled up menacingly at Lacy. Then Gabe grinned and huffed out a puff of foul breath. Lacy greeted Chiefy warmly and he rose on his hind legs to walk as a dockman could, but rarely did. Good work, Chiefy. You've reached your full growth. Thank you for taking on the care and maintenance of our two-legged pack mates. They are weak in senses and strength, but still dear to us. Chiefy wagged his entire body in ecstatic response. I heard that. A low, gravelly voice rumbled from just inside the side door. You may be the senior alpha, but I'm still your dad. Show some respect, girl. I have skills. Lacy huffed her nausea-inducing breath towards Earl, and Gabe grinned. Earl had already been smiling and now rumbled out a chuckle. We'll all take a run through the house so the pack members can learn the layout, and then we'll adjourn to the pole barn for the feast. The poor, frightened livestock are all penned inside the big barn. A swarm of large, furry beings swept into the log cabin and filled the space with their multiplicitous immensity. Most people would have found it too crowded and reeking of death for comfort. Earl and Val welcomed it as the warmth and smell of their extended family. Earl scratched at his daughter's back. You've built a unique and wonderful pack. You really are a good girl, Lacy. End of Book 1. So quoth this raven. I do love a happy ending. Have a wonderful Saturday, my darlings. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.